Good morning, Joanna. You get 1 Corinthians again. It's a plot. There's a general thing about reading Paul's epistles. That is so. So I'm pretty sure that you were one of the. In fact, I distinctly remember that you were there when I was talking about how the Bible is the product of an oral culture, and so even though it's written, people who wrote it didn't know that you needed to include in the text explanations about what tone of voice and so forth, and body language you need to read with. And so the Bible provides the words, and it expects us to do to add the expression. That's particularly the case with Paul's letters when Paul writes to a specific church. Not necessarily Galatians, which is a sort of general epistle to a whole bunch of churches. But when Paul wrote to a specific church, it's not like he would stick the letter in the mail. There wasn't a mail service. Paul would write it down, and then he would send one of the people that he trusted. Like we know that Timothy carried one of the letters on his behalf. And he was sending them to churches where not everybody could read. In fact, it's quite possible that the majority of the people in those churches couldn't read. So it's not like Timothy showed up and said, "Hey, I've got a letter from Paul. I'll put it over here on the desk, and you guys can, when you get a chance, you can go read it." That's not how it worked. Timothy would get there, and then he would deliver the letter on Paul's behalf. And we don't know for sure, but it's highly likely that the person who carried the letter would be the one that Paul had dictated it to, because Paul mentions at one point, he says, he's at the end of the letter, and he says, "Look what big letters I'm using as I'm writing to you with my own hand." So there's an idea that maybe he had really bad eyesight, or maybe incipient Parkinson's or something, that he had trouble writing. But for whatever reason, it does appear that he dictated his letters. So the way it would normally happen is Paul would dictate the letters, and he would he'd be angry, and he would be talking to the imaginary audience, and then the person who had taken the dictation would take the letter. And so he would know what tone of voice Paul would use, because he had heard Paul using it, and then it was his job to be like Paul, to give Paul's letter. So what you're doing in this chapter, this is the very famous chapter on the body of Christ, and it's in a section of 1 Corinthians. Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and it is his second letter. We just don't have a copy of the first one. And he's mad at them. And he has spent 11 chapters just blasting them for all the different things they've been doing wrong, and they had been doing a bunch of things wrong. But then when he gets to chapter 12 and 13 and 14, he's talking in these chapters about what he wants them to be like. Instead of criticizing for how messed up they are, he's trying to show them this is what it's supposed to look like. And one of the biggest problems that they had is that they were using every gift that God gave them. They were using it to try to make themselves be important. They were fighting for status in the church, and so everything that God gave them that they were supposed to use to help their brothers and sisters in Christ, they were using for their own benefit. And so he's trying to explain to them how this works. And the famous chapter on love, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am only a clanging brass, or a sounding brass, or a clanging cymbal." Right? Love is patient, love is kind. That's right in the middle between chapters 12 and 14, where Paul's saying, look, chapter 12 is God's given you all these gifts, and he's given them to you so that you can help other people with them. You've been using them to struggle over power. What you're supposed to be is love. And then you get chapter 13, which is just this incredible chapter. And then he goes on to chapter 14 and starts explaining to them, so, since you're supposed to be acting by love, since God has given you gifts to help build the church up, let's talk about your worship services. And let's talk about how your worship services need to turn into something that is constructive, rather than being something that would make anybody who walked in off the street think, oh my God, these people are insane. Which he literally says. He literally says, if anybody comes in off the streets and you're all babbling around in tongues, they're just going to think these people are crazy. It's not going to win them over to Jesus. So that's the context, right? So what you basically have to do is you have to go through and figure out, all right, what are the main points that Paul's trying to make? Because when you're explaining something to someone, like I'm explaining to you now, right? You slow down for the important parts. You emphasize. You're trying to do everything you can to make it easy for people to understand what your main points are. So the first paragraph, for example, the point of the first paragraph is there's lots of gifts, but it's the same Spirit. And there's a phrase that he repeats over and over again, but the same Spirit. So you want to lean on that phrase. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of working, but it's the same God who inspires them all in every one. Right? So you slow down on the same part. This is when we were talking about your essay, and I was talking about parallelism, right? And Paul is using parallelism to let us know it's the varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of working, but the same God, right? That's that opening sentence. Then to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So that the next, to one is given through the Spirit. Emphasize that part. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom. To another the utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another faith, by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing, by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are inspired by one and the same Spirit. And you'll notice that I just sped up with that list. The gifts are not important. And you don't make them important in the speech. All the gifts are for is just to emphasize, hey, there are lots of these things. Doesn't matter how many there are. There's just one Spirit, right? So, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. Then you can just race through the next bit to make it clear that the individual gifts aren't important, because the Corinthians had been arguing over which gifts were the most important. They actually had been, right? So you make it clear, actually, the individual gifts don't matter. It's the one Spirit that matters. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the ability to distinguish between spirits. You hear that intonation? We use that intonation in lists to make it clear. And then, we go second tone. Second, yeah, we go second tone at the end of each phrase, right? Right? To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the ability to distinguish between spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. And if you're just reading ordinarily and you haven't thought about this, you'll say, to another, the interpretation of tongues. And in the sentence, because there's a period. But there's not really an end of a thought. Right? So it's to another, the various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are inspired by one and the same Spirit. See how that works? So then you'll go through the rest of this, and you're going to do the same thing. Paul has a tendency, he's got a point to make, and he'll give examples, and the examples aren't what matters. What matters is the point. So you just make sure that you know what the point is. For the body is one, and the emphasis is one, right? For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body doesn't consist of one member, but of many. And then you get examples. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body. And you kind of make them sound stupid, because that's a stupid thing to say, right? If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that wouldn't make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, right? And they would be running each other down. So this first part is the members that don't have any self-esteem, they're like, oh, I'm not even important. Oh, yes, you are. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body. You can see right now the problem with me sight reading this is that I was racing through and I got the intonation wrong the first time. Did you notice that? I was reading it with the arrogant people, but the first part is actually not the arrogant ones, it's the ones with the... If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that wouldn't make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, that wouldn't make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, how would you hear? If the whole body were an ear, how would you smell anything? Right? But as it is, God arranged the organs in the body, right? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. Then the next part is where we have the arrogant people. Right? The eye can't say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those parts of the body, right? So that's the general thing. And the last bit is the only place where Paul gives any sort of idea in this whole discussion, where Paul gives any sort of idea that he ranks the gifts. This last bit where it says earnestly desire the higher gifts. So the last paragraph, you're the body of Christ, individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then workers of miracles, then healers, helpers, administrators, speakers in various kinds of tongues. Is everyone an apostle? And this is a rhetorical question, and the answer is no. And you know, in English, we can ask a question in a way that makes it clear that the right answer is no. Don't say yes, right? So, is everyone an apostle? Is everyone a prophet? Is everyone a teacher? Does everyone work miracles? Does everyone possess gifts of healings? Does everyone speak in tongues? Does everyone interpret? And he doesn't say no because it's obvious that he means no. And in Greek, grammatically, there's instead of intonation, there's a word that you put in that makes it obvious that the right answer is no. So he doesn't have to say no, because we already know. But eagerly desire the higher gifts. And it is at that point that he interrupts himself to say, but I'll show you an even better way than desiring gifts. Desire love. Because chapter 14 is where he will set out that the higher gifts are the ones that do other people the most good. And he was talking to people. The specifics in Corinth was that a group of people had gotten the gifts of speaking in tongues, and they thought it was awesome, and they thought speaking in tongues was like the most important thing in the world, and that people who spoke in tongues, they seemed to have thought people who spoke in tongues were more spiritual than people who didn't. And so the one thing that's clear is every time Paul lists the gifts, he puts speaking in tongues at the end to make it clear that speaking in tongues was not really that important, right? But the reason is not that there's anything wrong with speaking in tongues. And you're going to say, and what is speaking in tongues? And that is a question for another time. But the reason isn't that there's anything wrong with the gift of speaking in tongues. It's that the people who had that gift had gone nuts over that gift. And so Paul's pretty much saying, you people who think you're awesome because you speak in tongues, you're not that awesome. Go take the lowest place. Stop trying to take the highest place, right? So that's, but in your reading, although you know that the thing on love is going to come next, although you know why it is that tongues keeps coming at the end, that's not your job to make that clear as the reader. That's Jason's job to make clear as the preacher when he explains the text. You're just reading it. So you just end up, is everyone an apostle? Is everyone a prophet? Is everyone a teacher? Does everyone work miracles? Does everyone possess gifts of healings? Does everyone speak in tongues? Does everyone interpret? But eagerly desire the higher gifts. And the important word, in other words, there's a big difference between saying earnestly desire the gifts as opposed to earnestly desire the higher gifts, right? The point of the gifts is to help people. If you want to be gifted, your reason for being gifted should be so that you can help people with it. So if you're going to desire gifts, you should desire the gifts that help people the most. That's his thought process. You don't explain that because you're just reading the passage, but you show it by emphasizing higher. But earnestly desire the higher gifts. Okay? Sorry, that went on longer. I didn't expect to spend 20 minutes explaining it. But anyway, so there you go. And I will, obviously, I will send you this because you just got the link. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching it. So, talk to you later.